In this presentation, we will continue our discussion from part 1 of the lecture, the financial planning process. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the 6-step financial planning process, apply steps 3 through 6 of the process, and understand how a systematic planning process helps promote client trust. We concluded part 1 of the lecture by reviewing CFP Financial Planning Practice Standard 300-1 that said, a financial planning practitioner shall analyze the information to gain an understanding of the client's financial situation and then evaluate to what extent the client's goals, needs, and priorities can be met by the client's resources and their current course of action. You will need to analyze the client's current financial plan by assessing current financial strengths, weaknesses, and gaps. For those of you who have studied corporate strategic management, this will sound familiar. It's basically a SWOT analysis applied to personal financial planning. Analysis that looks at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. Does the client's current course of action put them en route to achieve their prioritized goals in a way that aligns with their values, attitudes, and risk tolerances? If so, then nothing needs to be immediately accomplished. However, in most cases, the current plan will have weaknesses or gaps that can be improved. In order to analyze the current plan to determine if the plan puts the client on track to accomplish their goals, you will need to identify reasonable, supportable assumptions. CFP Financial Planning Practice Standard 300-1 states, the practitioner will utilize client-specified, mutually agreed upon, and/or reasonable assumptions. These assumptions may include, but are not limited to, the following: personal assumptions, such as retirement age or ages, life expectancy or expectancies, income need, risk factors, time horizon, and special needs. And economic assumptions such as inflation rates, tax rates, and investment returns. In analyzing the plan, you'll move through each of the relevant planning areas. For example, cash and debt management. You want to identify what financial assets are available right now. What economic resources are available to increase future net worth and earning capacity? Are there emergency funds? What is the status of the client's cash flows and use of debt? Is there a systematic savings plan in place? How are the asset accounts titled? Income tax. Have steps been taken to minimize the tax liability? Risk management. Is risk effectively managed with insurance? Are catastrophic loss exposures covered? For example, with investments. What about the client's investments? Is there adequate diversification? And do the asset allocations properly reflect the client's time horizon, risk tolerances, constraints? Can the current allocation produce the level of return required in order to meet the client's needs? Education. Is there adequate funding for the child's future educational needs? Retirement planning. What is the retirement need? And what retirement assets are currently available? What can be done to improve this strategy? Are there any glaring weaknesses? What are the opportunities for improvement? Estate planning. Well, estate planning starts with the will. Is there one? If so, does it reflect the post-mortem wishes that the client has today? How are the assets owned? Are the beneficiaries of retirement and insurance contracts correct based on current life circumstances? How are the assets titled? Is there adequate estate liquidity? Now that you've collected and analyzed the current data, the next step involves synthesizing planning recommendations that will improve the plan and presenting those recommendations. Series 400 of the CFP Practice Standards addresses this part of the financial process. As described in that document, developing and presenting the financial planning recommendations represents the very heart of the financial planning process. It is at this point that the financial planning practitioner uses both science and art, formulates the recommendations designed to achieve the client's goals, needs, and priorities. These three practice standards can be described as what is possible, what is recommended, and how is it presented. You'll want to consider alternative strategies and products. Which action plan gives your client the best opportunity of achieving their goals in a way that is consistent with their values, preferences, and constraints? Is the current plan or one that requires significant modifications? Your solutions need to be appropriate for the client's goals, experiences, values, risk tolerances, preferences, and constraints. With all the variable inputs, probable scenario outcomes, and different assumptions, you may produce more than one solution. If this is the case, consider presenting alternative plans. If you're producing a comprehensive financial plan for the client, you will address cash management, educational funding, tax planning, insurance, investments, retirement planning, and estate planning. Therefore, you may need to coordinate with outside specialists prior to developing your plan recommendations. Synthesizing those recommendations is the science of financial planning. You will use your core planning competencies to develop integrative plans. You will employ a systematic method in synthesizing integrated planning recommendations. This method will start with the end goal in mind, address obstacles, perhaps such as unrealistic goals, control and manage risk, the issue of risk versus return, identify how the recommendations will be funded. You're thinking about the cash flow constraints. And prioritize the implementation action steps. It's important to remember that there may be more than one viable solution. Rarely in life is there only one way to accomplish something. Your job is to assess which integrative solution is best given the current circumstances. Now that you have developed a solution to the client's financial problems, it's time to run it by the client. The reason I say it that way is because the plan isn't necessarily the finished product. It might just be a draft. Your action plan might jar some new insights by the client or new information that the client feels you should have. Perhaps someone that needs to be considered as part of the plan was left out. Or sudden money, perhaps an inheritance, was just realized. This will start the cycle of discovery, analysis, plan design, and plan presentation all over again. But that's fine. It's moving both you and the client towards an eventual solution that will benefit the client. In communicating this information, you'll want to strive for clarity. You might be using visuals. Avoid industry jargon that can confuse. Offer a logical presentation flow. Engage the client in a conversation. Solicit feedback. Personalize the presentation so that the client hears your story or hears their story and connect that story, those goals, to the recommendations. In effectively communicating the recommendations, you'll want to review the client's goals because, as mentioned, you want to link your recommendations to those goals. Explain the underlying assumptions, discuss your observations, maybe even discuss the advantages and disadvantages of some of the alternative solutions that you considered, and then offer your specific recommendations. Always confirm that the client understands the recommendations. This slide contains some excellent suggestions that were shared by Lisa Bowie at a FPA seminar. According to her, a good plan design communicates the concepts in an enjoyable and engaging way, explains the assumptions, analysis, and recommendations, motivates the client to take action, creates guidelines or policies for making future decisions, and furthers the client-planner relationship. As described, the intent of the presentation is to communicate the message in an understandable and motivating manner. We will investigate client communication in greater depth later in this course. Knowledge is only power when it's put into action. Once all the presentation questions are answered and the plan is accepted by the client, it's time for taking action. The initial step at this point is to determine the role of the planner and the client. Will the client implement the plan in its entirety? Will the activities be divided between the planner and the client? Will outside consultants be used for part of the implementation? As stated in CFP Practice Standard 500-1, the financial planning practitioner and the client shall mutually agree on the implementation responsibilities consistent with the scope of the engagement. Now that the financial plan was approved by the client and implemented, the final step in the process is to monitor performance and adapt to changes. Just as discussed about implementation, it's important for the planner and the client to define responsibilities. Who's going to monitor the plan? How often will performance be reviewed? What type of change constitutes an event that should immediately be looked at? A financial plan is a dynamic document, and it will have to be fine-tuned to keep everything on track as structural changes occur. The frequency of scheduled reviews is subject to many variables, including the complexity of the plan, risk, desires of the client, economic conditions, and client life changes. Depending on the results, the strategic planning loop just discussed may begin again. Have you ever heard the saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care? Sit back for a moment and think about it. Who would you want to deal with, especially when it relates to your financial future? Many of you are attracted to this profession because you want to help people and make a difference in their lives. If that is your mindset, then you'll have no problem establishing the client relationship. Your intentions will come right through, and your client will quickly develop the trust necessary to implement strategies, stay with the plan through market turmoil, and adapt to changes without paralyzing fear. Actions that help you build client trust include fully explain the financial planning process. For example, why do you need all that personal information? Know your client's story. For example, what's important to your client? What are their dreams? What are their concerns? What keeps them up at night? Offer full disclosure and transparency. Commit to high ethical values. Embrace a formal discovery process and the systematic planning process, which shows professionalism. Listen to your client. Engage your client throughout the process. In this lesson, you learned about the 6-step financial planning process, job tasks associated with steps 3 through 6, and how a systematic planning process helps to promote client trust.